Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you are joining us today for this digital workshop on technology in the church. My name is Joe Swimmer, and I'm the Executive Director of the SEEP Network. And on behalf of SEEP and the Hard Edge Network, we are pleased to have you with us for this important conversation. We have a terrific panel that you'll be hearing from in just a moment. But we wanted to say thank you for joining, and that we look forward to engaging you in this and several more conversations on this topic in the very near term. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Janelle, and Janelle will introduce our panelists. So thanks again, thanks to our panelists, and we look forward to hearing what they have to say today. Take care.
Thank you so much, Joe, and we are all really interested and excited to have this conversation today. But before we start the conversation, I would like to, as Joe just said, introduce you to the fellow panelists. So I'm going to start with John.
Thank you, Janelle. I'm John Reeder. I'm a retired Anglican parish priest, but a senior research fellow with the William Temple Foundation.
And Stacey?
Yes, I am the part-time rector at Little Fork Episcopal Church in Rixieville, Virginia, and the founder of Learning Forte, which is a consulting company that helps nonprofits and congregations and seminaries intersect in the space of hybrid ministry.
And Mark?
Yep. So Mark Howe, I'm based in the south of France, and I'm a software developer, amongst other things, and my current project is building software for Bible translators.
And my name is Janelle Aldred. I am a head of communications. I'm a communications professional, former broadcaster and journalist, and also an author. So my first book is coming out in September with SPCK, and I am based in London, and the book's called Communicate for Change. But without further ado, what you've come to hear today is the conversation. And so we really wanted to unpack church and big tech. And as we all know, the coronavirus has given us such a moment of transformation and given us many opportunities, but with that there are also drawbacks. And so we want to explore the good and the bad today and think about what do we want as we move forward into the future. So the first question goes to Mark, and he's going to speak to us a bit about this topic, and then we will have the discussion. Please put any questions in the Q&A box or any comments in the chat. We will try to pick up as much as we can as we go through, so please do comment. We want this to be as interactive as it can, not just us talking, but us all kind of talking and collaborating and joining in together. So Mark, as congregations, how do we keep the good of the tech that we've taken on in the coronavirus, the COVID, and how do we manage the risks?
Okay, well, excellent question, big question. I think it's a challenging question because I guess none of us plan to be where we are now 18 months or 2 years ago. I'm just looking at church leaders I've known for a long time in this part of France. I think of many church leaders who are not particularly involved in doing anything online. Many of them would have had sound reasons they would have said for not doing that, and then suddenly along comes COVID and all that goes out the window. They're doing stuff by internet because they don't have much of a choice. There hasn't been some massive theological reflection behind it, and suddenly it's all happening and there are surprises. And then I guess within many churches you've got the people who are kind of going, yes, this is the future, this is what we needed, this is great, do we actually need these buildings? And a few people going, this is the end of life as we know it, and then other people in the middle. So even within our congregations there's a range of views on that. And then as we come out of it, it's do we just go back to what we were doing before? Is this the new future? Where do we go with it? So I mean, it does seem to me one of the things to do, one of the things we need to do is take the time to reflect on what's actually happened. And it seems to me that's probably rather a complicated story. Different people are going to experience things differently. I know, for example, there are people who are maybe already stuck at home, had difficulty getting to church. This has been wonderful for them. Their experience will be very different to people who were looking for physical contact and so on with people, and they've lost that side of things. So I think hearing different people's stories is going to be vitally important. I think maybe reflecting theologically on what we've maybe learned about church, or just the fact that this has forced us to see church differently. I think I'd say those are two of the big things that we need to do before making any big decisions to do things or not do things.
And I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know what Stacey or John thinks about thinking about, do we need to start thinking about church differently? Because we have seen the very different side of what church can be, because before it was very much, we need to be in the building. And I think you just spoke about, Mark, you know, prior to COVID, people would say to ministers, let's go online. It was like, no, we need to do all these things to go online. And all of a sudden, here we are. So, you know, what do you think that you've learned about church in this time, Stacey, that's informing you to think maybe differently?
You know, it's so interesting because I think that I've learned that in some ways something I was taught as a child. I mean, I remember the little children's story, you know, here is the church, here is the steeple, open the doors and see all the people, right? And I remember being taught that the church was the people, not the building. And I think that that's a piece of what I learned this year, is that church, being the body of Christ, really is the community. And yet at the same time, as a rector, as we've reopened, and I'm now trying to get people to come back to church, I also am in the process of teaching and thinking and reflecting and writing about how the people need to come together too. And so I think I've learned not to be tied to the building, but also the importance of physical gathering. And so it's a both and as we move forward.
And John, if we think about risk, you know, and think about, okay, what are the risks of tech in church? Are there risks? Are we thinking about this rather negatively? You know, as Mark said, we're all coming at it from a different point of view. For some people, this is the best thing that's ever happened. What should we be reflecting on when we think about the risks of tech in church, so to speak? You're on mute, John. That's a risk.
Yeah. Have you got me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you, yes.
Yeah, the risk is messing up the technology, which is an easy thing to do all the time. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think it's looking at the balance of presence and absence. I mean, we've had a particular experience because I retired just before the pandemic, and retirement means moving to a new area where we don't know anybody. So our engagement with church has been Zoom church, where basically we're seeing people we don't know on a screen. And certainly my wife feels that we're just consumers. You know, it's like watching a TV program. We're not really able to participate in the same way. So you lose the sense of knowing other people, of being in a building together, of being able to sing, of being able to sort of gather with that sort of physical presence. So it's those sort of things that are lost. So yeah, risks definitely in terms of loss of physical presence and gathering, I think.
And I guess for everyone in thinking about that, how do we keep the good? Because there is a certain amount of fluidity, and when we talk about gathering, is good for gathering those who can physically gather. But we know that so many people, you know, I grew up in Pentecostal church where we call them the shut-ins, people who are shut in at home, and for them, before a lot of times there's no way to be involved at all unless people physically then come to you. But now we have access to that, but we know technology costs. So there's lots of different things. So I guess, Mark, you know, what good is it of this that we really need to try to keep?
Okay, so I think one of the things that is important in answering that kind of question is to actually evaluate the different type of things we're doing online and offline in their own terms. I think one of the things we can slip into is saying, well, we know what church is what we were doing before, and then we evaluate everything in terms of that. And if you do that inevitably before you even start, you know it's going to be worse because you've essentially given 100% to the thing you have already and not given any possibility of getting any pluses, and it's all going to be minuses. So it seems to me that we need to say, well, what we're doing here online is different, and then sure, we evaluate it in terms of scripture and all sorts of other things. I mean, I'd say accessibility is on one level is important. So as I say, caregivers, people who can't necessarily get to church. We've had people who have hearing problems. We don't have any equipment for that in our church, and they said, well, basically I follow the service much better at home because I can just turn the volume up or put on headphones or whatever. So I think that's that maybe be one thing. Yeah, I'll stop there.
No, yeah, and I mean, kind of moving into our next question, which is something that, you know, because we had a pre-call and the things that came out are kind of shaping the discussion that we're having today. But this is to hear your thoughts, John. You know, how does digital mediate the church's life, removing the positive and negative? How do we access the sacred differently with the mediation of technology? And I think a point for that is just services have changed online. They're not the same as being in church, but they're not as long. We've made them different. So how are we accessing the sacred differently? And is it good, bad, indifferent? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just think it's different, and I think we're exploring, we're discovering. But I'm into the area of whether not just our practices, but actually our beliefs, if you like, are being changed by being mediated by the digital. So one of the ideas I'm exploring with others is the idea of sacred, not just being sacred places, sacred times, but actually being a process. It's part of the process of unveiling, of encountering, etc., which can be mediated possibly by the digital, and we've got to recognize it as such. Then even possibly our understanding of God, if I can go that far, might itself be being transformed in some way by us understanding ourselves in constant interaction with the digital. So this is quite sort of profound, fundamental stuff, and I don't think we know. I think we're testing this out, and that's okay. That's fine, as long as we're aware of the dangers as well and what might be lost along the way.
I think it's interesting because all of our attentions, we know our attention span due to online is less. So we can consume less, we watch less. So services have had to be shortened because they say, well, no one wants to watch a 40-minute sermon on Zoom. No one wants to, you know, the praise and worship has to be a bit more dynamic because, as you mentioned earlier, John, as your wife says, it can be a bit like watching a TV show, and no one watches a TV show for 90 minutes, 2 hours, unless it's very gripping. So, Stacey, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because it is fundamentally changing the way we do church. And will people want to return back to a 90-minute, 2-hour service after zipping through in 60 minutes?
Well, so I'm probably going to say something that I will pause. I had a pause in my thoughts about whether I wanted this recorded for all prosperity, but I will. I don't want to return to that. I actually, as a priest, I've been ordained 21 years, and I have found a great amount of freedom in not feeling like Eucharist has to take an hour and 15 or an hour and a half. And so even as we've been reopened for almost 2 months now, I find my services are shorter in person too. I mean, I'm consistently coming in at under an hour. And so I think there's actually some value to that. So I'll tell a quick story in that I have always struggled with how the American Prayer Book in the Episcopal Church sets up the Palm Sunday liturgy. And for the first time in my priesthood, I gave myself permission, because we were doing it online, to work with it. And it was the most powerful time I've ever experienced that liturgy. And I have to be really honest, we will probably do it all in person next year, but I don't know that I'm going back. And so I think for me, there's been some of that freedom to ask some questions of the liturgy that have been fruitful. Now, there are clearly things I'm thrilled. I was so tired of preaching to a screen without being in conversation and relationship with people that, you know, it's such a gift to be back and have more of a hybrid approach now. So I don't want to make it sound like it was all good, but I think there are places in which we've been given some freedom, or at least I have, to ask some questions that I needed to ask.
So that's what it gives, Mark. What does it take away? You know, are we trying to look for takeaways and there are none? You know, we can search too hard, and as ever, we would love to hear your thoughts. So if you're watching, if you agree, vehemently disagree, please, you know, we want to hear your comments in the chat. You can also be anonymous in the Q&A, so please do ask your questions. But Mark.
Okay, so things that take away. I guess one of the things which is, I mean, less the case with Zoom than it was when I was doing online church 15 years ago and it was all typing, but there's still it's still less immersive, and so it's slightly harder to pick up cues and that kind of stuff. And I guess one of the things I found just from using Zoom in in business. I work on a team where most of the people are on the other side of the Atlantic, and digital communication is just incredibly efficient. It lets you do all sorts of things you couldn't do before. But it seems like you kind of lose the kind of the oil, the lubrication that makes human relationships work. And so yeah, certainly a lot of groups I've worked with, we found that we actually need to jump on a plane once a year and be in the same room. And if you do that, well, that kind of gives you the capital to do another few months of Zoom and emails and so on. But it seems like at some point you actually need to be there just to get the full sensory experience of communing with other people.
And someone has made a good point in the chat to the panelists. What about learning from denominations that have used TV and other remote formats for years? Now, something that I would definitely say that I have noticed is almost a looking down on what would have been termed televangelists, and that format of preaching and teaching and doing church as the lightweight side of church. And so how do you think that affects our thinking as now we've had to move to that and to using some of the techniques? And do you sense there could be reluctance in people because it's something that we have thought long was beneath us, for want of a better phrase? I would love to hear anyone's thoughts on that.
I've just seen somebody I know say, what about a hybrid model? And I think that's probably what is going to be the case, not just in church, but in working practices as well. And that's something we're going to have to get used to. I was just smiling to myself while Stacey was talking about sort of cutting down numbers of services. I mean, quite regularly on this morning, I have a 9 o'clock service, 9:45 service, 10:30 service. I couldn't do an hour. I wouldn't get to the next church in time to actually take the service. So it's a discipline I learned fairly early on to sort of keep the liturgy within bounds and know it's in the space of a moment when I needed to get in the car and go to the next place. But that's just a different discipline. I mean, but are people going to want to go back? I had a request yesterday to sign up to a meeting, and I was given the option: do you want to be a Zoom meeting? Do you want to meet outdoors socially distanced? Do you want to meet indoors socially distanced? Do you know which one I put? I put Zoom. And I thought, you lazy so-and-so, you put Zoom, because it was just easier to do that. And there's a sense in which you don't have to make the effort. You know, I can sit here and talk to whoever, but I don't have to sort of make the effort to get in the car to drive somewhere. But again, what's lost by not actually doing that?
No, yeah. I'm sorry, Stacey. Sorry, Mark. Go on.
I was going to say, I mean, there's the effort, but I think also there's, I guess it depends what we're looking for from church. I mean, my wife said several times that in some ways she preferred doing Zoom church to going to our French church, where churches were open, but with massive social distancing and everything else. And she said, basically, we can actually have the quality of the conversation was better on Zoom because you could actually hear each other and see each other properly, as opposed to shouting to people through masks, with a huge distance between you and so on. So that wasn't so much laziness, not least because our church is short walking distance, but it's actually in some situations, particularly if Brick's church is compromised by COVID or whatever, it is actually objectively a better experience in certain ways. So it seems like I think we need to weigh all the separate things up as we go.
Okay, moving on. So Stacey, this one is kind of your thought. How has the church responded to theology development in the past, and how can we approach technology with critical reflection? And a question has just come in basically saying that engaging a digital attendee requires different thinking about the dynamics. So I think this all comes in with that. And I would love for you to also answer the question that I posed about the televangelist, because I saw you smiling in that. So I know you have thoughts and I want to hear them, because we got a little bit sidetracked, but go.
Oh my gosh, I think there were 3 things there, so I'm going to try to pull them apart.
I will pick up the ones you don't pick up and remind you.
Thank you for helping me. I think that let's start with the televangelist. I think that one of the things that we have to really recognize is that whatever we design, if we use a design thinking approach and we bring some of that thinking to this conversation, whatever we do has to meet the needs of the contextual community. So even if we as Anglicans or Episcopalians were going to use all of the same technology that evangelical televangelists would use. We would do it in a different way because we would be meeting our contextual realities and the needs of our communities. And so I think that that's a really important piece. It's the same way that what I do in my small rural congregation that's been around for 290 years is very different than I would have done when I was a chaplain at the National Cathedral School for Girls. I mean, and so we have to recognize that context has a lot to do with that. And so I think, that's my televangelist piece.
And how do we respond to how we responded to technology in the past, and how can we approach technology with critical reflection? And someone has mentioned that people can change channels in a heartbeat, just switch you off if they don't like it, much easier than walking out of a church building. So how do we reflect on this and approach it?
I think that we place ourselves, both when we think about technology and about people changing channels, we place ourselves in the context of generations of churchgoers and lay people and clergy. What's happening with us is slightly different, but not that much different. I mean, technology has been changing since the papyrus was developed and we shifted to, where we wrote letters and how we recorded things. Technology has been developing and the church has had to face that. The printing press, as those of us who consider ourselves Protestants, would radically impact how the church faced and served the community. And so I think the place we are now, I always think is that I think of myself as being in the generation, a parallel generation to clergy who were at the point where the printing press had become common. And there was the question of, were you going to start to participate in religious tracts or not? Were you going to start producing what you were thinking and saying in a way that the common person could get it or not, get access to it or not? And so I think that one of the things that's helpful is to recognize that people before us have faced similar challenges. And as far as people changing channels, as soon as cars became common in the United States, people had the ability to drive past their local parish to go to a different church. And so that's been my entire life. It's been the life of most every priest serving in the Episcopal Church today. And so that I think that that's an important thing to recognize. That's not a new thing. It's a little different, but it's not new.
But it's not new. And Mark, thinking about this, I think maybe it's our humanity. We try to couch things. Is this better? Is this worse? When it's just different. How can we get ourselves in that headspace of thinking just different rather than the comparison? Because actually it's apples and pears, because what was to what is to what will be, I don't know if we can even compare it.
Sure. I mean, I think what Stacey was saying is important about the fact this isn't like some big change where everything's been static, in the past. I mean, the example I take of technology would be the car, which Stacey mentioned. And when the car started to become popular at the beginning of the 20th century, people said a lot of things about the effect of the car on community, which we're now saying about the effect of the digital revolution on. People were saying things like, well, this is elitist, some people can afford cars, some people can't, so it's not inclusive and it's going to break up local communities. So I mean, the two interesting things are, first of all, we're still here, we're still in community, church still exists, and in fact most of our churches now depend on the car. And the second thing is that those concerns weren't entirely stupid. I mean, the church has changed, the nature of what a church has changed because people don't all live within walking distance of the church bells. And I think for me, if I was to say one thing about how we navigate this, I think I'd want to say that church is about people, and we don't have either online people or offline people. We have people. And so, for example, when we talk about reducing attention spans, well, people's attention spans were being reduced anyway because those people were watching television, doing YouTube, doing all these things, whether or not they were doing it with church. I mean, that's the world that those people lived in anyway. Church has come to this often belatedly, but that's the culture, for better or worse, that we live in. So it seems to me basically we have the same challenge that the church has had with culture for the last 20 centuries of saying the culture's moving. To what extent do we kind of fight against it? To what extent do we accept it and go with it? And to what extent do we actually try and push it in a direction that reflects kingdom values and helps us with our mission and other things that are important to us as Christians?
John, because change is just inevitable and has been and will be. So how do we stop almost the shock and awe that things have changed? Please share your thoughts.
I don't think it's that so much. I think it's the speed at which it has changed is sort of taking people by surprise. If you go back 18 months, one couldn't have imagined that church has become as it has over the last sort of 12, 15 months, really. And I think people adapt pragmatically, and that's fine initially. You find yourself doing things. I mean, I'm in the ideal position of no longer being a parish priest, therefore I've not faced the challenges of getting 8 rural churches online. I mean, it couldn't be done for a start. So I have sympathy for my colleagues who are trying to do that. So you struggle with the pragmatics, which is a good thing, because you're developing new skills. But then when do you get the time and the opportunity to stand back and reflect and think critically about what it is you're doing, on what basis do you actually do that? How does it get beyond just pure practicalities to a deeper sort of theological or philosophical level? And I think one of the things, the speed is really interesting, as Mark was saying, because people have got used to working in that culture. But I do think if you're not careful, there's a diminishment of relatedness and relationships if this is the only way in which we communicate with each other. The soft signals of being in somebody else's presence are lost unless you happen to already know them. So if you're starting from scratch trying to build something up just by this method, then I think that's quite serious and needs to be looked at quite critically.
I think that's, John, I think that you're exactly right, is that our challenge now is to take a step back, to slow down now that we're not faced with having to figure out every Sunday that's changing in front of us all the time, to make sure that we go back and we do that theological reflection, that we do the critical theological conversation. And I think that is an imperative piece of responsibility that we have. And Janelle, I know that you've brought to us a conversation about holding in tension that idea of connection and accessibility and how those things fit in this conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing. I don't know if I'm quite a digital native. I'm probably just a bit old to be a digital native, but digital has been part of my life since I was 16. So I've very much had and been glued to a mobile phone since then in my life. And so there have been times of life where online church was the only thing I attended, because I either felt there wasn't a church near me in my locality that I really wanted to attend. And so I would watch churches, sometimes from overseas, sometimes in England, and just consume church online in that way until I felt comfortable or confident to enter back into a service. So I think it's an interesting, church has now offered a lot of other people a real viable alternative and choice for church, and it's become accessible in ways that it has not been accessible, because before on church were mainly mega churches or big churches. Well, now you can have a smaller church and not a brand name church, for instance, we might want to call it, that you can access. But what you do lose is the connection, because you may never actually meet those people. And it's like someone just said, like the soft skills and the soft touch and seeing someone's face and feeling, their energies and their emotion when you're in the presence and doing corporate worship in that way. I think there's a great connection in corporate worship when everyone's in the same building. So I think I am wondering, how do we hold these two things that both bring something beautiful and unique to the body, but actually I don't always think you can have both at the same time. You can do them at the same time, but for the person accessing it, they could have accessibility but no connection, or connection but only accessible as and when. So I'm really just thinking, I think it's great for people, as someone just said, people who are seeking faith, very accessible, low bar to entry. So yeah, that's the thing that I'm thinking about in my head about connection and accessibility.
So I wonder if one of the risks is that it becomes self-selecting communities. So you shop around and you just locate yourself within a community in which you feel comfortable, which agrees with your particular theological or even your political views. And the danger is that you're never challenged by being made to feel uncomfortable by a sermon that sort of makes you think differently. It just becomes, if you like, a theological echo chamber in that sense. Whereas if you go to your local church and you don't like it, or you don't like the vicar, you don't like something about it, you know, it's easy in theory to move on and find somewhere else, but maybe there's an argument for sticking with it. Maybe that's where you should be. If all you ever do is move on to the next one because it's easier, is that actually always a good thing?
Let me just share an anecdote from our parish. So I'm in a small rural parish which used to have a name about 20 lines long, which finished with the disseminated parishioners of the Louvre or something, because basically it's a large parish with a small mountain in the middle, and the parish is aging. So we've had a problem for years just with getting enough people together in one place when it's not a Sunday to have any kind of meetings. And so this time at Advent, we all locked down, so we couldn't do anything else. So we did things in Zoom, and we had much better attendance. But also we realised that because we weren't constrained to somebody having to drive over a mountain in the dark, that we could actually get a critical mass for meetings that we simply couldn't get and hadn't been getting even before COVID. Now, in terms of what we do now, I mean, what you miss out with that, particularly in France, is the food and all the other stuff that you do whenever people meet, and so on. I mean, going forward, we're thinking, well, maybe we don't have to choose. Maybe we can have, sure, we can put something on Zoom, but maybe we can have a couple of places where people can meet up, and we can have a camera in each of those places. And so the people who want to kind of get together can get together. We can have a sharing of 2 rooms for the people or 3 rooms for the people in Zoom, and the people who are at home can join in too. I think there's quite a lot of scope for kind of ways of mixing this up, so we don't have to say this is 100% everyone in front of their own computer or 100% everyone in the same space. There may be some quite creative solutions that, at least for us, fix problems that we had long before we were forced to go online.
It's an interesting one. So go on, Stacey.
No, go ahead, Janelle.
No, I was saying it's really interesting because even at my work, we are, some of us back in the office and some of us still online. And so we have a rule that if there's a meeting, either we're all in the office, everyone in that meeting, or everyone in the meeting is offline, because there's a sense that there's this kind of double thing going on when some people are in the room and can participate very, very freely without the, as me and Stacey just demonstrated very ably. And then the people who are online who are missing all of the little cues and social cues that are going on in the room. And it's really interesting to think about when we talk about hybrid church. Someone said earlier, what does that look like? And I don't even necessarily think it's bad. I'm not saying bad or good either, actually, but I'm just saying different, and just thinking through the implications of in the room, out the room experience, relational, even when it comes to work, as people say, people who are in the office more likely to get promoted because you're closer to leadership because they're also in the room. What does that look like in a church where we need to think about cultural diversity and difference? And someone in the chat mentioned disability and just different things. Are we diminishing other people's chances of not doing all that God's called them to do, but being in a position where they're in the space where people get to see them and interact with them? And I wonder what that looks like in an online space. Sorry, Stacey, then John.
John, I just want to hop in and share an example of someone I think who's used some of this to turn some things on its head. So I have a colleague who is an associate, and the rector has just retired, and so they're entering an interim period, and he was asked to arrange for the preachers for the summer, and they now have the capability, because of what they've set up to have hybrid, is to have someone preach remotely that would be into their Zoom piece, but also could be projected into their worship space, their gathered worship space. And he has had a really creative response to this, in that he's choosing to have women and people of color be their preachers for the summer, because he wants to plant the seed of what clergy and rectors look like before this church heads into their search committee intentionality in the fall. And so I think it's one of those things for me, it comes back to what's the context we're in? What are the things we're trying to address in that context? And how can we be thoughtful about the contextual realities and the theological realities of that particular space, and then make those decisions about hybrid or digital, in person or online. John, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, I was listening to a sort of clergy colleague who, and it's not just about liturgy, about leading worship, it's also about sort of church meetings. And she was saying, and this is her, not me, but it was an interesting comment really. He found trying to conduct meetings on Zoom quite frustrating really, because they were very sort of focused and intense. And what was lost was the willingness to engage in a wider discussion and debate. So you think, right, I've got to say what I've got to say and then shut up and somebody else speaks. Whereas if you're all together in a room and a meeting, again, it's the soft signals, the other interactions which go on. And she said, I think it's limiting disagreement. You want people to have their say, to voice their feelings. If you've got just that focused moment of time and that's it, you're not going to do that, possibly. I don't know. Or maybe we develop different protocols, different ways of doing that. So we become better at handling this as a medium, using it in a way that we should be doing.
I felt like you were going to say something there, Mark, but you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, so I was going to say, I think one of the issues there is what technology, what medium. I mean, we're using Zoom at the moment, which I think is which is very good for some things, but we need to remember that Zoom wasn't built to run church any more than particularly Facebook was, any more than Messenger was, and so on. All of these things were built to meet some other need, and we've kind of repurposed it as best we can to make it work for church. And so it seems to me the kind of issues we get are going to depend radically on that. I mean, I've seen broadly people doing either kind of broadcast church over Facebook or YouTube or whatever, and people doing Zoom church. And if you do Zoom church, then potentially it becomes quite interactive, hard to scale. Everyone talking at once, that kind of thing. If you've got something on your Facebook wall, well, no one's talking because it's essentially a broadcast with people chatting in the background. So you don't have that problem, and the problem is that you don't have that problem. So it seems to me that choosing the technology has a huge effect on what kind of church we have, and maybe our technological choices need to be theologically informed, and also maybe going forward what we need is technology that's actually tailored to what we as Christians believe about community, rather than assuming that something that's made for a business conference or online dating is a perfect fit for what our church needs.
And I think that's a really, really good point. The tech was not created for what we are using it for. So we are kind of retrofitting what we're doing into the mediums that we have, which are not perfect. I've just seen something come through, so please do share. I'm going to try and track back and go through a few comments for discussion in our last few minutes, so do please keep them coming. But someone says, we have absolutely developed our ability to disagree within Zoom church in a way that we haven't done before. We split into small groups for prayer and also for discussion after a discussion starter or video, etc. Now, there is something about this medium that for some things feels more confrontational and for some things feels less confrontational, because actually you're not in the room with the person, and so to disagree can sometimes feel a bit safer, just the physical distance. This is one of the good things. I'd love to know some of the other great things that the panelists have kind of picked up, and also what you think about that point about learning to disagree well over Zoom.
I'm in the middle of helping a United Methodist Conference develop a intercultural competency online course for leaders. And so I have to just keep coming back to, I think that has so much to do with what was the culture of the church to begin with, and what was the culture of the people that were attending the church to begin with. And I suspect, or my gut is that sometimes we find what is present in our community, our local cultures, amplified via Zoom, both positively and negatively, possibly. And so that may be one reason some different people have had such different experiences.
Mark?
Well, I think every technology and every way that people meet together ends up not being an even playing field for everyone. I was saying to somebody yesterday that when we did some pixels, which was largely typing, people who were essentially good at typing but good at expressing themselves in writing were at a massive advantage. And the demographic we ended up with tended to be more educated people, simply because they found it easier to keep up and put down interesting thoughts, and also because the culture, we gradually ended up with a culture where people picked you up if you misplaced your apostrophe or something. I mean, it seems to be Zoom, so I think it's more subtle with Zoom, but it's still that it works very well for some people and some personalities, and so on, and less well for others. I mean, one thing that people, some people who are very introvert just find it alarming having so many faces and the impression that you kind of need to somehow keep eye contact with everyone, and they're all looking at you, and this is a huge pressure, and other people don't feel that at all. And I think all I'd say to that is that actually the same is true when you walk into church. If you're not, most of us here are used to it, so we don't see it anymore. But people who walk off the street into a bricks church have exactly the same problem of what's going on. Here I am sitting here ready to do a service, expecting to watch something. Everybody stands up. Why have they stood up? Now they're singing. What are they singing? Why are they singing? Oh my goodness, they sat down again. I mean, if you deconstruct our liturgies the same way that we started to deconstruct Zoom, I think we'd say that actually our liturgies are pretty opaque to outsiders as well, and that also creates a barrier. So I think, again, it's really about it looking closely at what we're doing online, but also now we've stepped out of our buildings, maybe turn around, look back at our buildings and see things we didn't see before about what we were doing in our buildings.
And that is such an interesting thing about seeing things that we haven't seen before, because thinking about prevailing culture, John, how much is prevailing culture a part? Because I think that is very interesting. If you're a church that's good at certain things, then do you just take that online, or do you find it difficult? What part does prevailing culture play?
Sorry, I was just thinking about what Mark was saying. Going back, I've got a friend of mine who's stopped attending Zoom church. He goes to sort of church properly now. Sorry, he goes back to the church building, but he likes watching live stream services because he gets that anonymity, which you would get if you go to a cathedral. You can sit there at the back. You're not part of anything. You're not under any pressure. And you can actually turn it off. It's there in the background, so the sort of background of it. And that's something you can do with music. That's something we do in the culture as well. It's a background presence, if you like. So are you consuming, or are you participating? Maybe the meaning of that is actually changing anyway because of the way that we encounter the technology. I mean, is music a good analogy? I mean, music is something that people used to do. You performed it, you participated. Now most of us sort of are consumers, or are we? Or do we just participate in a different way?
I mean, I think people have always consumed church, or some people, a proportion of people have always consumed. I think growing up, I was a pastor's kid, so there's always a core of workers and helpers in a church. There's like 10% of the people doing about 80% of the work. And thus has it ever been, and I think probably thus shall it evermore be. And the rest of people, and many times that's been myself because I felt I paid my dues as a child, has kind of more come along, enjoyed, done some singing, listened, gone home. I think there's probably a lot of people, for a lot of reasons, and especially if you've grown up in church, people who actually enjoy the anonymity about church as an adult. So I'm not sure if that's an online only consumption, but happy to be wrong. But I think many people will behave similarly to how they were behaving.
Early in the pandemic shutdown, I heard someone present, and they said something that made so much sense to me, and I've never been able to find a citation for this, so I share it hesitantly. They said that anytime that there's a crisis, it just accelerates what was already emerging in the culture. And I think it's fascinating to me as I think about all the times we've stopped in this process to say, well, that was already sort of happening in church. And so maybe a piece of what the pandemic has done is removed our ability to deny some of these things that were already present in our churches and in the reality of Christian community in the 21st century.
No, I agree. Mark, what are your thoughts? And we're not really going into social media today, because I know we kind of touched that, but we're not really going into social media. But I think social media has that same thing. It's an exacerbation of who we are. It doesn't make you do things. People say, oh, social media makes people mean. Well, no. If you're not mean, you probably won't write mean things. So how much of this is just an exacerbation, and as someone said, like an absolute speeding up of what potentially, because you've been doing this for a long time, trying to encourage others for a long time.
I mean, I'd say there's clearly an element of that. I mean, often when people talk about online church, the first thing is, well, how do you know that people are being themselves? And I always say to them, well, hypocrisy is based on a Greek word. That wasn't even, Paul was talking about hypocrisy a long time before social media came along, so we didn't invent it. I think that's true. I think it's also true that the medium is the message, and that being in a different being on a different medium does affect the way people behave. I mean, I think one of the issues that some people are still struggling to get is that email, and particularly social media, is written, so people tend to imagine it as a kind of a written thing, but in many ways it's oral. I mean, because it's very immediate and so on, but at the same time there's just an infinite there's an eternity to what you write, so it has all the spontaneity of chatting to your friend at the pub or something, but at the same time, once it's happened, it's there, it's recorded on 1,000 servers, anyone can screenshot it, it's never going away, and it could come up and haunt you 30 years later. And that's a really odd kind of mix compared with things we were doing before. And I think all of us tend to forget that sometimes, and I think a lot of people, to be honest, have never actually taken that on board at all, and that's how people end up saying things that I'm sure they would never have said had they thought through what they were actually doing.
So someone said, remember, a computer is a machine that allows us to make the same mistakes 1,000 times faster. So I guess in the last, few minutes that we have is, I guess, almost thinking to the future, and, what do we think we would like to see? And I guess one of the things I probably would like to see is stop talking about digital church and in real life church, because as someone mentioned earlier, it's all the church, and by making that demarcation, we make it something very, very different and not part of the same thing. So we'd just like to hear from you all. What are your thoughts about the future, John?
So I've just seen a question in the chat, somebody asking what about celebrating the Eucharist online, and I think that's been quite a big issue, certainly in the Anglican Church, that I don't think in the UK has been resolved or sorted out at all. And again, if you hold a doctrine of the real presence, whatever that means, what does that mean? Now, I've actually been sharing Eucharistic practice with a fellow priest in another part of the country online every other week. And I don't know, I probably shouldn't say this, whether it's legal or not, but since we're both retired, nobody's going to excommunicate us at this stage. But because we're a sort of close relationship, two couples, we find it quite profound and quite moving, and we're going to continue that as a practice. So why would that not be possible? I don't know, we're pushing the boundaries, but it feels okay. But in terms of regular church worship, I think it means that it's become non-Eucharistic essentially on Zoom as I've encountered it. So what is going to happen about celebrating the Eucharist? Who's going to sort that out? Who's going to sort of tackle that theologically and say it's okay? And I guess underlying that is almost a question which crops up of authority, really, within the churches now. If people can't decide for themselves what to believe, what they're going to do, etc., etc., where are the boundaries, and who decides where those are? So I think it's an exciting time, because there are new things happening and we're being challenged, and there are new thoughts and maybe new beliefs or new ways of expressing those beliefs. And as long as we sort of explore those at some depth, really, then we've got to go with it, and that's good.
I think for me, Eucharist is the ultimate example of how online kind of shines a spotlight on what we were doing already, and I've done some writing around this area. And one of the problems I found was that as soon as you start looking at what we actually do in our buildings now, it kind of gets complicated. I mean, I don't think, whatever views we have on Eucharist, I don't think any of us will claim that what we do on a Sunday morning comes straight out of what Jesus did when he ordained, whatever we're not sitting around the table. He certainly wasn't doing it as part of a weekly act of worship. It wasn't in a special building. In many ways it was different. And if the idea of this is this part of a meal, I often say to people that what I receive on a Sunday morning doesn't really qualify as a meal. So in a sense, we've already been on a long journey of adapting Eucharist to make it work in our ever-changing worship patterns, and then also on an ecumenical level, it seems to me that the agreements we have about the right, what we can all agree are actually based on a very careful set of words and a very careful understanding of how we do it and things. And the massively disruptive thing about online church is it throws all of that in the air. So you can no longer rely on the kind of, we all know what it is, but we're not going to actually talk about it. You suddenly have to make everything incredibly explicit. And at that point, it becomes very uncomfortable because we realize that actually this whole area is a bit of a minefield. So again, for me, this would be an encouragement to say let's take this as an opportunity to look at what's possible online, but also let's look at what we're doing already and ask how did we get there and how is it working, and other maybe assumptions that we're making in what we're doing in our buildings that we need to revisit.
Yeah, Stacey.
I think that speaking as a parish priest, I think that my theological challenge to myself and to my congregation is to get really clear about why people need to come back and be part of the congregation on Sunday morning. And that is not an easy question to answer right now, but I think that that's the place in which I am consistently challenging myself, and at the same time continuing to live stream and welcome people remotely and digitally, but also to be very clear about what is the value added in someone's life to come and be part of a community and journey together as part of a community that is all seeking to be disciples together.
And I think something that I'm continually questioning, thinking about myself as someone who has enjoyed church on and off over the years because of the way I find church to be. So online church has been something that I've found particularly transformative for my own faith and journey, and has kept my church life alive at times when, if it were just for the one I could travel to, it would not be, still going. And so I think, how do we view ourselves as vessels and conduits for what God is doing, rather than thinking that we, the church, are doing it? Because I think sometimes that's actually part of the problem, is that we think that we are doing it by having church, and actually the Holy Spirit is the one doing the work and doing the drawing and doing the calling and the evangelizing. And so, as conduits, what is the best way for us to reach this world, which for me is surely the aim of what we're trying to do, is to reach people who don't yet know the good news. And how best do we do that as a community of believers? And in 2021, what does that look like? Maybe to look less at what we like and how we would like to do it, and think more about what does this world need for us as vessels and conduits of God's work. So I would love to hear any final thoughts. We do have some questions, some other questions about the Anglican Eucharist, and is that a theological issue? And I think someone did nod to the theological issue of the Eucharist. And if anyone wants to speak to that quickly for Julie. Anyone? Any takers?
How long have you got?
I think it is a theological issue, Julie, of which I am definitely unqualified to speak on, so I will not. And someone says, are we irregular online participants if we talk and pray together? I think yes. And yes, I think people are just generally talking about encouraging people back to the building and what can we do how can we articulate that people should come back to church? Does anyone have any final thoughts on that? Stacey?
Well, I was just going to say, the people I'm encouraging to come back to church aren't my active digital participants. It's all the people who I find sort of sliding under the radar, who really aren't participating in my digital community at all and just aren't coming back to church. So that's, I think, the people I'm thinking about encouraging.
Our experience in our parish has been that people were very happy to have online church while it was there, that most of the people who were coming to church before, with about one exception, have come back as soon as they've been able to. But several of those people have said to me, well, we're in a church where regular attendance is kind of once a month. People don't tend to come every week. And I've had several relatively old people saying to me, I have never been in church so much because I'm still now coming once a month, but actually I'm watching the rest of the time at home. So actually I'm getting far more input and I'm more aware of what's happening in the community than I was before. So, I mean, for me, I guess the key thing is, like Stacey was saying, that it's not about the church and steeple, it's look inside and see the people. The continuity comes through people, and it's actually the same people, whether they're in a particular week, they're in the building or online. And so maybe it's concerning if we have people who are only online, and maybe it's a little concerning if we have people who can only feel they're in church when they're in the building too. But if you have people who are navigating between those two things, maybe that helps to balance it out, and maybe that actually gives a more rounded experience of churchness than what they were getting before.
John, did you have anything to?
Yes, it was only, and I'm sort of used to what we call rural multi-parish benefices, where it's highly unlikely that you'd have a service in the same church each week. So it could well be, as it is here, it's once a fortnight. So once a fortnight, we can actually join the local congregation, and in the intervening weeks, then we share worship online with our friends. So we're getting a sort of double dose in a different way. So rather than traveling, maybe we ought to travel to some of the other churches in the benefice on those intervening Sundays. So there's sort of pros and cons with that. But I think ideally, my wife would say, let's go back to church, please, because we don't yet know anybody where we live. Where else are we going to meet people unless we actually become, we've seen their faces. It would be nice to actually get to know them properly by being at church together and at church events. So I think we'd want to go back, really. Yeah.
And I think I would probably just say that I think from the discussion, I would gather that, yes, there are drawbacks, but actually I think there are many, many, many more opportunities. And as I think John, Stacey and Mark have all said in various ways, it is about contextualizing the church's locality, their congregation, what works for them, and how they can use the various mediums to the best advantage for the people that attend. And the one thing that I've always found beautiful about many denominations, and I come from a family who's very interested in ecumenical work, is that there's something for everyone. And I think the beauty of it is that people will be drawn to something that speaks something of their heart. And yes, sometimes that does create echo chambers, but sometimes that gives us a safe space to express our worship on a Sunday, to head out back into the world on a Monday or on a Saturday, or whenever you worship and gather. So thank you very much to everyone. Sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions, especially around the theology of the Eucharist, but I am pretty sure that there will be something out there that may be able to answer some of your questions. But thank you so much to the panel, to Stacey, to John, to Mark. Thank you also to Jonathan and Joe who've dropped off the picture. But thank you to HeartEdge and SEEP. This has been an amazing discussion, and we hope that you have enjoyed it and gleaned something from it. Take care, everybody.